All righty, we are, it's 10 o'clock, so I guess let us get going. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about education. So again, as with the families unit, I shortened it down from what I've had in past years so that we can move through it relatively quickly. I think there's some interesting kind of things to say. But again, I want to get on to the topics after that. Work and sex and intimacy are, I think, the most fun, and I want to kind of make sure we have time for those, hopefully before the next midterm. Okay, so we talk about education, right? Education obviously is really important when we talk about youth, because outside of the family, school is where they are going to spend most of their time, right? It's the primary occupation, and it's the main site of what you would call secondary socialization, right? Where they're going to get values and norms from teachers and from peers. So it's, incredibly important, just behind the family in terms of general importance, right? And if we're talking now about kind of youth in late modernity, right, millennials and Gen Z, you're looking at young people spending an average of, at the minimum 13 years, and at the outside, we're now talking about 17 or 18 years of their life in some kind of educational environment, if we include post-secondary. So it is incredibly important, right? I mean, secondary school, as I've said before, so high school used to be one of those big life markers, right? Where, especially for the boomers and to a lesser extent for Gen X, if you graduated from high school, right, your high school diploma served as your basic credential that you could use to go into the workforce, and you could get a good job with that. Now, there's still a little bit, I think, of a cultural hangover of this, right? Because we still treat the graduation from high school as a major life event, right? That completing secondary school is somehow a big life transition, right? That's why you have a prom or a big grad party and a celebration, which I always think is kind of funny now, because looking back at it, I'm just like, wow, I got to celebrate high school grad, and that was my transition to even more school. For me, it was a lot more school. I don't want to say how much, but I guess another 12 years of school for me after that. So, what a big life transition graduating from high school was. And like I said, this is a sort of cultural hangover from the boomers and from Gen X, where that high school diploma really got you, into the workforce, and you could get a factory job or a job in manufacturing with just that credential. That's obviously shifted now with Gen Z and with millennials, right? Where now the base credential increasingly is the bachelor's degree, right? A 4-year or at least a 2-year secondary degree of some kind in order to get a really good paying job. Okay. Canada and the US, and we're mostly focusing on them in this course, have kind of a checkered history in terms of the quality of their schooling, right? Both countries, if you look back into the 1990s, were relative laggards, right, in terms of global performance. In the 1990s, they were kind of in the ranks of countries, they were in the 20s and 30s, right, in terms of highest rank. Now, Canada undertook, major reforms in the 1990s, particularly in 2 provinces in Alberta and Ontario, which changed the kind of overall profile of Canada's scoring on international education tests like PISA, right? So, by 2010, so 2 decades after 1990, Canadian students basically were scoring second in reading, 5th in math, and 5th in science, and 6th in mathematics. And they kind of stayed there for a long time. In recent years, our math scores have gone way down, and we dropped, into out of the top 10 in terms of our math scores. Much of this has been blamed on a program called Discovery Math, which instead of teaching one approach to mathematics was like, children, discover your own way to do addition. My wife is an elementary school teacher, and we've had many debates as to the virtues of this. No, she's like, no, it really works. I'm like, it really doesn't. I can show you the statistics saying we suck at math now, so something's going wrong, right? And certainly the uptick of mathematics skills has been much slower, and it's reflected in these international tests. The US consistently scores really badly on international testing. However, one thing to note about the United States, it is a massive country. It has almost as many people as, say, the European Union. And the states are not all equal. So if you took, say, Massachusetts, right, just the state of Massachusetts in the Northeast, it would actually be second place in the world if it was just that state. So when people are like, oh, the US has such a crappy education system, sometimes, right? It depends on where you are. If you took Massachusetts has a really good primary and secondary education system, and their students score really well. However, if you take California, Alabama, Mississippi, they score incredibly poorly, down in the 40s and 50s in terms of global rankings. So it kind of drags the US down as a whole. And the US has a very bizarre, educational culture. One of the things that always amuses me about the US's educational culture is that often, especially in the South, the highest paid member of the faculty is the high school football coach, who can command a salary of, $600,000 to $1.2 million, depending on the size of the high school. This skews the whole educational system in really funny ways. You got your Friday night lights where high school football is a big deal. So the US is a kind of a weird player, and it doesn't score particularly well, but that, again, is very dependent on where you talk about in the US. Yeah. So it's all by state. Every state runs its own education system, but the federal government gets involved in some ways. Like sometimes they will offer, I know you're testing my knowledge of US education policy. Sometimes they'll offer incentives for states to adopt certain curricula, right? So a few years ago under Obama, they were trying to get a curriculum adopted called Common Core, right, where all the states would basically be teaching and testing the same materials. And there was federal funds attached to adopting Common Core. And then George Bush had a program called No Child Left Behind, which was similar, right? If you could achieve certain test scores, you got certain numbers of federal funding. But generally, the actual education policy and curriculum is set by individual states. What this tends to do, though, is that basically 3 states set the curriculum and everybody else follows. It's California, Texas, and New York. And the textbook publishers all kind of publish for those states. So sometimes you get really weird things where, you know, Texas will teach something a little bit differently, and then a whole bunch of states teach it just like Texas, except the ones that don't like Texas, and then they all teach it like California. So you can have like vastly different educational approaches depending on kind of political alignments with the big states that tend to have large populations, and therefore the textbook publishers publish to them. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a complicated landscape. Like in Canada, inevitably we get a lot of our educational material that's geared for Ontario, especially in English Canada, because it's such a large jurisdiction. So a lot of the textbooks are actually published with kind of Ontario curriculum standards in mind, and then everybody else sort of uptakes them and modifies them as needed. But again, that's just because, what is it, 1/4 of the population of Canada lives in Ontario or something. I don't remember. Okay, sorry, did I answer your question? Okay. All right. Okay, dropping out, right? So dropout rates generally have, oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Yes, of course.
I know, like, in Canada, we have where, like, you know, if you're a student graduating high school, you want to apply to university in, like, BC or different provinces, you get, like, an automatic GPA boost to, like, account for, like, curriculum differences.
Okay.
Do they do the same thing in, like, the United States, or?
So the US is a little different in how they judge student admissions. And it's really controversial, but it's one that's been used a lot, is you probably heard of it, the SAT, right? Or the standardized aptitude test, where basically, I can't remember what they score you in the SAT. I know there's math, there's science, and I think there's reading and writing on the SAT, or English, it's probably English. And so the SAT scores are taken into account a lot of times. And in the past, they were privileged over actual GPA, especially to account for the fact that there's a lot of places in the US that have, to put it politely, pretty terrible education systems. And, you know, the way the US works is very different from, say, how Alberta works. The US has always had an education system that's premised on zip code, right? So you go to whatever school you are, you live in, like, the postal code or zip code area of, unless your parents can afford to send you to a private school, right? But all of the state funding for you goes to the public school in your neighborhood. So people don't really have a choice as to where to send their kids unless they're pretty rich, which has meant that a lot of kids, especially those in underprivileged neighborhoods, go to pretty terrible schools that are funded pretty terribly. And so the SATs were always viewed as a way of, you know, you could have a kid with sort of middling GPA, maybe because their school is not very good, their teachers aren't very good, but they might score really, really well on the SAT because they're just really bright. And so oftentimes they took the SAT into account more so than the GPA to kind of balance out some of those educational differences. Yeah, everybody runs the same SAT test, right? So it's a national test, and it's always been meant as a sort of test that's meant to judge essentially IQ, right? Or intelligence or potential, and kind of things that people have learned as well. And it's supposed to be standardized. It's called the standardized aptitude test, right? For that particular reason. And yeah, now there's been a lot of controversy. Like, people have accused tests like the SAT of being sort of ethnocentric, right? Where white students have tended to score better on it than, say, black students. Although Um, and so like, oh, I can't remember. Which college was it? It was a big college. I want to say it was maybe UCLA, or Stanford, stopped taking the SAT into account because they said it was racially biased. And they've sort of reversed that decision now because they don't have a great metric. And it's really hard to judge a student from, say, Massachusetts, which has a really good education system, versus a student from Mississippi that has a really poor one, right? And the disparities in the US education system are so vast between states. I mean, you don't have to. If you're not planning to apply to college, a lot of people don't actually take it, right? But if you're going to apply to college in the US, you pretty much have to take it because it is one of the things that most colleges require, right? And I mean, it's a big deal, right? There's, I think the year before, like when you're in the 11th grade, you do the PSATs, right? Which is the practice SAT tests. And there's all sorts of consultancies that basically work, like tutors that work to help people get better grades on the SAT because it's judged so much. And again, that creates some economic kind of inequalities, right? Because it's like, oh, could you afford the tutor that's paid $100 an hour to help prep your kid for the SAT, right? If you LSAT prep courses, yeah. Well, good for you. That's good. No, yeah, and there's all sorts of games here. I'll talk about it when I talk about tuition, but this just came out maybe last week. They were talking about this, that people who are sending their kids to like private prep schools are paying sometimes their consultants, basically their education consultants. So you're starting this when your kid's like 9 years old, paying an education consultant sometimes as much as $60,000 or $70,000 a year to basically tailor your kid's educational experience in the US to get them into an Ivy League school, right? So this is like, because apparently I've gotten too far into educational experience in the US. I'll tell you anyway. The Ivies, right, had this category of students that are called the legacy students, right? So your parents went to Harvard, your grandparents went to Harvard or Yale or whatever. And so in the past, you would make a donation to your alma mater and they would let you in. This has come under a lot of scrutiny by the Department of Education federally because obviously, like, you know, if you could let someone like George W. Bush into Harvard, something has gone wrong. George W. Bush was chronically a C student, but he got into Harvard anyway because his family's incredibly rich. A little concerto to go with your class. And so like they would let these legacy students in. So you're having like C students at Harvard, right? And they were not there so much for the education as for going to Harvard and continuing the legacy of their family. And of course, you know, having gone to Harvard or Yale or Princeton brings with it a sort of prestige. They've cracked down on that. So now all of these legacy parents who are still for the most part pretty wealthy, are like, damn, I have to get my kid into Harvard. So now I'm paying, you know, $60,000 a year from the time they're 9 till 18 to try and get them. So their CV, you know, they've got the right activities, they played the right sport, right? Little Johnny, you want to play basketball? Too bad. Lacrosse is the sport at Duke. And so we're, you know, I didn't know. Yeah, it's an incredibly corrupt process in the US, and it's driven in large part by money. But yeah, they're saying now that to get your legacy kid into, you know, somewhere like Harvard or Yale, sort of the minimum donation is about $2 million, $3 million, right? So it's not even parents who went to Ivies can't all make $2-3 million donations, right? So they're paying these consultants to tailor their kid's resume, you know, from age 9. It's crazy, right? It's a weird system that's been twisted by prestige as well, right? You've got the Ivies, which are really prestigious, and it opens a lot of doors, right? You can go work at Goldman Sachs or one of these fancy financial firms. Anyway, I'm sorry. Does that answer your question? I completely got off track, but it's a weird. The U.S. education system is weird, corrupt, and needs to probably be destroyed and rebuilt in a way that makes a lot more sense, right? Okay. Dropout rates. Okay, dropout rates, obviously a concern, right? Because even though the high school diploma now isn't what it used to be, it's still seen as important, and it's certainly a gateway into other post-secondary kind of opportunities, right? So whenever kind of dropout rates go up, you tend to get governments get really, really concerned about the reasons why. I mean, there's been a ton of research on dropout rates, who drops out and why, and it seems to be, generally highly correlated to social class and gender. Working class and poor kids drop out at much higher rates, often to help, support their families, right, to bring in another source of income because school is taking up so much time and they can't necessarily work. The higher minimum wage, so the higher the minimum wage goes, or the entry-level wage, the higher it goes, the higher the dropout rate tends to be, because there's an economic calculus, right? Will I make more money if I get my high school diploma, or will I make more money if I just go work? So especially, in the kind of boom years in Alberta, right, when oil prices were extremely high, prior, in about 2013, I remember, dropout rate in Alberta was about 25%, and it was principally driven by and it was really high amongst young men especially, and it was driven by jobs in oil and gas, right? Prior to the kind of 2015 drop in oil and gas prices, rig jobs that required essentially no skill, they required a pulse and not much else. You just had to be there and be alive for the most part. And they paid really, really well, right? And this became really attractive, and it became a value proposition for young people looking at high school. It's like, if I graduate high school, right, maybe I'm 16, I could go work on the rigs now. If I go, or 17, 18, I could go work on the rigs right now and make a ton of money now, or I could finish high school, sacrifice those wages, probably still have this idea of I need to go on to NAIT or something and do more. And it's a long kind of, in the future, when am I going to make that money back? So that tends to, people make rational economic decisions for the most part. When wages are really high, it's going to drive, especially for entry-level jobs, it drives the dropout rate, quite a bit. As wages come down, entry-level wages come down, and the number of opportunities in those jobs goes down, dropout rates tend to drop on their own. That said, every single time you see a rise in dropout rates, governments kind of have a collective freak out about it, right? Because there is this notion that these people are sacrificing their future economic benefits for present economic benefits. And that's correct, right? If you look at it, they might earn, more money than their peers now, but if you look at it 10, 15 years in the future, they're going to be earning considerably less. And typically, like the top out kind of pay for someone with less than a high school education in Canada is about $42,000, right? That's the best you can ever hope to do, which is not a lot of money. Lower socioeconomic class plays a big role in it, right? You have very few kind of middle class, upper middle class youth dropping out of school. It's a relative rarity, right? Whereas, working class and poor youth drop out a lot more. Obviously, because, they want money. They're probably trying to help their families cope with the economic circumstances they're in, and it just makes sense, right? Okay. First Nations groups dropped out, or Indigenous groups dropped out at twice the national average in Canada in the mid-2010s, right? This number has dropped a little bit, and there's been a lot of active efforts to keep Indigenous youth in school for as long as possible. And it seems to be beginning to sort of turn a corner, like it looks like it's getting better, but still a long way to go. Immigrant groups, and especially those from Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, have generally pretty low dropout rates, right? Now, this is probably driven by one major factor. Their parents are, if they're coming over to Canada especially, they've been selected by Immigration Canada, or what is it, Customs and Immigration, I can't remember the agency name, but basically they're scored, right? So they're typically educated and middle class, so they see the value of education, and it seems to be a cultural value that these middle class parents bring with them to say, you need to get a university education. So they have really, really low dropout rates. Dropout rates on the whole, marginally higher for males than females, although it's not a huge difference. And again, it tends to be really contingent on the basic economic kind of environment that you're in. on the whole, right, men tend to be able to get, these kinds of jobs I was talking about, right, in places like oil and gas, high wage entry jobs, a little bit more easily than women do. And so, in periods where those wages go up, the disparity gets bigger. Okay. The reasons for dropping out vary a lot in surveys. A lot of it is economic, as I said, right? People leaving school to go work, right? Either to support themselves, support their families, because they see economic potential. In some cases, right, people with sort of behavioral issues and especially antisocial tendencies, probably poor parenting, right? And those that then find themselves more at odds with teachers in the school system do tend to drop out at higher rates as well, right? So problems with attendance and school staff often leave young people, especially marginalized young people and people with those kinds of antisocial tendencies. I see your question. I'll get to it in a sec. Feeling like they don't have a lot of choice. Yeah, Amog.
Just to clarify, this is talking about dropping out of high school?
Correct, yeah, dropping out of high school. No one cares if you drop out of university. The government isn't like, it's a crisis. It probably should be, but. Okay, I don't know. What was I saying? No one knows. Class dismissed. I'm kidding. People in subcultures, so criminal subcultures, gangs, and then other kind of subcultures especially with antisocial tendencies tend to drop out at higher rates, right? And again, they tend to be singled out by other students. Staff often see them as a threat and will focus on them in different ways. And so they're more likely to get kind of sort of gently or not so gently pushed out of the school system. Generally, youth who drop out of school, right, high school, tend to report it immediately as a relatively positive experience. They were not thriving in high school anyway, but one that eventually gets worse, right? Long-term, and especially things like long-term earning potential, is seriously degraded. And so it tends to become a less positive experience over time. Okay. Oh, sorry, Mia, go ahead. I mean, on the statistics, if you're not in school, you're considered to have dropped out, whether you were expelled or whether you left by choice. It's pretty difficult, especially in Canada, to actually expel a student fully unless, the conditions are like very violent, right? And so most times problematic students are just kind of nudged out the door or sort of pressured into it. And it becomes, they make it unpleasant for them to be there. And so they just leave of their own accord. That's the more typical pathway. An actual expulsion for behavior is relatively rare. It doesn't happen it happens, but it doesn't happen a ton, right? It's not the normative kind of experiences of those who leave high school. Question answered? Okay. All right. So we're living through this right now, actually. I wrote this slide 10 years ago, but it's still true today, and it's actually more true than it ever was. So what we're seeing today, right, is an increasing demand globally for post-secondary education. We have a lot more countries, right, in the world that essentially having a post-secondary education is becoming extremely important, right? Places like India, places like Pakistan, China, South Korea, a lot of parts of Nigeria, parts of sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. We're seeing that college education is very important to get ahead in these economies. However, a lot of those populations, they've developed a kind of large middle class faster than they've been able to expand their own post-secondary institutions. So what's happened is that they've sent a lot of students, and students have looked for educational opportunities outside of their home countries, right? So it's pushed the kind of demand for post-secondary education all over the world in an upward direction, right? Now, obviously, we've had this discourse in Canada just recently, right, about limiting the number of international students that are actually allowed to enter the country and study at Canadian universities. Because to some extent, some Canadian universities essentially use this as a way to make up for flagging demand at their institutions, especially in things like the humanities and social sciences, right? So they've made up some of the budget shortfalls with international students. I think I was hearing about, I think it was Lakeland University in Thunder Bay. It was something like 60% of the student body was international students, right? Bringing in a lot of international students. And it's just about getting a credential from somewhere, right? There's not enough like South Korea famously has way too few educational opportunities for the number of people who want to attend university. So they have to find those opportunities elsewhere. Obviously, that does a couple of things, right? It's driven up the cost of post-secondary education in the West significantly by just growing kind of student bodies, increasing costs, and generally allowing universities to do some goofy things with their money, while claiming that their product is super in demand, right? So not tailoring them to actual needs in the economy, but just continuing to grow programs that people are taking because they don't have a lot of other choices. It's also led to a lot of abuses of international students, and we've kind of found this out, where I think again of Thunder Bay, I think it was something like 15 Asian international students were all living in a 3-bedroom house together. So our 3-bedroom basement suite, it wasn't even a house, it was a basement suite, and there were 15 people living together. So there's a lot of abuses that have come from this particular trend, right? And I mean, one of the things we know, especially about South Korea, is if you can't get into a post-secondary institution of some kind, it does leave you on a life path that doesn't have a lot of opportunity. So the typical path, or not maybe the typical path, but a common path for those who can't get into any university is unfortunately to take their own lives. So there's a lot of weird pressures going on that force people into really, really bad situations. And a lot of it has sort of been hidden. So increasingly, one of the things that gets talked about as well, right, is everybody needs some kind of post-secondary education. This is driven a lot by the sort of discourse of the post-industrial economy, right, that we're moving into an era of essentially white-collar jobs, right, jobs that are mostly in the service sector of some kind. And often, just pushing people that would not have been tracked into a kind of university degree traditionally into university, into programs of potentially, how shall we say, questionable economic value down the road. Part of this is what we actually call educational inflation, right? As employers especially have started to look at, a bachelor's degree or some kind of post-secondary degree as the basic credential, more and more people have been getting it, which means it's been worth less and less. So the other thing that's happened along with this is you've had this kind of push towards what sometimes people say is a master's is the new bachelor's degree, where it's sort of expected that, if you're going to really get ahead in the economy, you're going to need at least a master's degree. This kind of general push of the population into higher ed, especially, has also had a kind of somewhat deleterious effect on the number of people who go into what you would think of as typically more working class fields, right? So now what Canada and the US, Australia, and Britain are all facing is a lack of skilled workers, right? Especially skilled workers in manufacturing and like the construction trades, right? And I know I have I think I've said it before, one of my really good friends is a plumber, and he could work 65 hours a week every week. That's how in demand his particular skill. I mean, he's a very good plumber. There are also very bad plumbers who probably couldn't work that much. He's a very good plumber, but he says like he could work 65, 70 hours a week if he wanted to. And since he's divorced and living alone, that I think is a real possibility. And then he subsists on a diet of donuts and coffee, which not good for your health. So there's been, in recent years, a sort of reevaluation, especially towards pushing more people into specifically vocational training, apprenticeships, and other jobs that come with a defined career path, right? One of the big problems that we've sort of seen in recent years is that a lot of people go through a university degree and they get something, and I'm going to say this and I'm very sorry, they get some combination of, say, a general science degree or an arts degree with a major in psychology and a minor in sociology, which potentially might be the most useless degree a university grants. I probably shouldn't say that, but I just did. Because it doesn't have a defined kind of career path outside, right? I cannot tell you how many, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut down your educational path. I can almost guarantee that like every year I get like probably 80 people asking me for letters of reference to some kind of master's program. And so I can say, right, the psych soc degree isn't as beautiful a career path as it might otherwise be. But it didn't used to be that way, right? It used to be that you had, you know, if you go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you had a bachelor's degree, right, you could get a very good job with any kind of bachelor's degree. It didn't matter what you had, because you would prove that you were in the top 10% of society, right? Because only somewhere between 10 and 15% of people got a post-secondary degree. Now that, you know, everybody has one, it's like, you know, what does it matter? Which again is kind of where this thing with Harvard and Yale becomes important, because it's like, well, what differentiates your bachelor's degree from another one? You know, if I went to, you know, Ohio State University and you went to Harvard, it's the prestige of Harvard and how hard it is to get in. So yeah, we're seeing an increasing push by governments on vocational training, getting people back into manufacturing and blue-collar jobs as those, you know, jobs are becoming more in demand, but fewer and fewer people are going into those fields. And then more part-time students, yeah. One of the other things we see is a push now towards lifelong learning and especially upgrading skills, often at your own cost. As the technological environment has transformed so quickly, workers are often required to go back to school to upgrade their existing skills, often at their own expense. Okay, so yeah, the cost of education generally has been going up as well. Canada, you know, because Canada has a system that's at least partially subsidized by the state, it hasn't risen as quickly in Canada, although, you know, like the total cost of your education, your tuition is actually only a fraction of that. Much of it is covered by the provincial government in Alberta, right? But we've seen, you know, all across Canada, tuition's generally rising, and generally rising faster than the rate of inflation. So that, you know, on average, you know, it's somewhere, depending on the school you go to, it's somewhere between $6,000 and about $9,000 a year in tuition at the average Canadian university. And I think Dalhousie has always been among the most expensive, and it's on the high end at about $9,000, I think. And you're stuck living in Halifax, so I think you have to eat lobster all day. No, I love Halifax. Halifax is a great city. I'm just teasing. Also, it smells funny. The harbor smells funny. I'm sorry, especially in the summer. It's quite stinky. I've lived in Halifax and it was stinky in the summer. But that was also like 20 years ago, so maybe they've cleaned it up a little bit, but it was kind of gross. Anyway, what was I saying? Right. So yeah, college tuition in Canada has gone up significantly. Average debt load, you know, in Canada was about $20,000 if someone went to for university, right? Coming out of university with about $20,000 debt load, about $13,000 for like a community college kind of level education. Now, I mean, I will say one of the problems, especially in Alberta, has been that a lot of the, you know, formerly community colleges have upgraded themselves to universities, and along with that has come substantial tuition increases, right? Edmonton used to have 3 essentially community colleges and 1 university, right? So it had Grant MacEwan Community College, the King's University College, and Concordia University College of Edmonton. All 3 of those have now become universities. Sorry, that was totally inadvertent. Along with that has come significant increases in their tuitions, though they still lag behind the very prestigious U of A, which I saw on the website today is a top 4 university in Canada and top 100 university in the world. So if you wonder why you pay so much for everything, that's why. Okay, US colleges rising much faster than that, though. I mean, and basically, the one thing that hasn't changed much, if you look about 10 years ago, is the cost of community college. It was about $3,200 a year for tuition at a community college in the US 10 years ago, and it's only gone up by about $500 since then. Everything else has gone up multiple times more than that. Actually, state colleges for state residents, I think was about $20,000 10 years ago. It's gone up about $6,000. State colleges for non-residents, it used to be about $27,000, now it's $43,000. So, all those young people in the U.S. who, they live in Ohio and they want to go to UCLA, or my favorite one, because I have a friend there, at the University of Hawaii, where all of the educational materials has people in bikinis and swim shorts. So she was very surprised when on day one, people show up in their swim suits to class. It was a very different experience. All of those have gone up by multiple times.
For some American residents, is it then cheaper to go to Canada for school?
No, because you would get charged as an international student, right? So you're talking about, it might be kind of roughly the same once you consider the currency difference. I'm trying to, it'd probably be about 60 to 70,000 for an international student in tuition. So that's what, like $8 US? I can't remember. I was in the US this summer, though. Everything's pretty expensive. And it felt crappy paying $27 for a meal in US dollars when I could get the same meal here for $27 Canadian. The currency difference might make a difference depending on when you're talking, but it's still, quite expensive and, different experience than US colleges. Private nonprofit colleges. So these would be places like University of Notre Dame, probably Duke. Maybe not Duke. Duke is kind of quasi-Ivy. But let's say Notre Dame, probably Baylor, and a few of these other places. They're private nonprofit, right? Almost $60,000 a year. And when you get into, say, an Ivy League school, just the tuition at the Ivy League school is costing you about $65,000 a year US. Plus, especially if you're going to an Ivy, you're living on campus typically. So then you're talking, probably another $20,000 to $30,000 in living expenses to live in their residences and buy their food. On average, you're probably looking at somewhere between, $80,000 and $100,000 a year to attend an Ivy League college. So the Ivies, right? That's Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, Brown. Is Brown an Ivy League? I think Brown is Ivy League. And there's one that I'm missing because I can never remember it. Dartmouth? Well, Oxford's a British university, right? So Oxford is its own crazy story. I have friends who teach at Oxford, and you could not believe how little the professors get paid. It is honestly, the equivalent of $35,000 Canadian. It was absolutely insane. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I was like, what? You work at Oxford and you're not a millionaire? And they're like, no, we get paid nothing. I'm like, cool. So why work there? Well, it's Oxford. I'm like, oh, I got you. My boss was actually offered a job. I don't even know what time it is. Oh my God. All right, I got 10 minutes left. I'm doing good. My boss was offered a job at Oxford, and basically when she saw what it would cost, she was getting paid like $42,000 a year, and this was like the best Oxford could do. Oh, can't believe we're giving it to you. And she was like, but I have to live in London, and how am I going to afford to live in England on the equivalent of 42,000 Canadian dollars? She makes a lot more than that here, and the cost of living is much lower. So yeah, there's crazy things with Oxford. It's very prestigious, but it kind of sucks if you're a faculty member there. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so one of the things that goes with this, right, is obviously the question about student debts. Student debt burdens have been rising, and at least the theory is that this puts a kind of upward pressure essentially it leaves other kind of life transitions later and later, right? So people move out from their parents' homes later, they get married later, they have children later as they're trying to kind of dig themselves out of these, if you're talking $100,000 a year in terms of tuition, right? Maybe you're talking about, $200,000 worth of debt. Okay, what does that debt look like? Well, in the US, student debt is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, which is a particularly nasty little thing that they've done to people there, right? So this was done essentially, so go ahead. So even if you go bankrupt, and you say like, I have no money, so all of your debts would get discharged, right? And the debt collectors would take whatever you own and sell it off to try and recover whatever portion of your debts they can. Student debt isn't dischargeable, right? So you can't get rid of it in bankruptcy in the US. So you could go bankrupt 17 times and you would still have your student debts attached to you. This was done by the federal government specifically as an incentive so that the banks would loan money to students without doing too much kind of work checking whether that investment was a good idea, right? the idea was everybody's going to do well coming out of college, and so it doesn't matter. But we need to assure the banks that they're not going to. A lot of these loans aren't going to go bad, right? Because we want as many people going to college as possible. So we need to basically tell the banks you're going to get your money no matter what. And this is what happened. So it's non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. So like basically the only way to get rid of it is to die alone with no relatives, because otherwise your debt gets passed on to your relatives. So super fun with that in the US. And this is why a lot of this debate, in the US about student loan relief has come up, because there's no way out of it other than to pay it off, right? When you're talking about $200,000, it can take a little while to pay it off, even if you're really diligent about it. Now that said, it's only about like the really big kind of amounts are really only held by the top like 30% of people. So people who went to the Ivies and people who did masters and PhDs hold the biggest chunk of that US student debt. So 4-year attenders is a lot less. Okay, especially at a state school or a community college, right? You don't have to load yourself up in debt. Okay, in Canada, it's a little bit different, right? In Canada, student debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy only after 7 years following the end of the last year in which the person attended any type of schooling, right? So basically, 7 years after you get out of school, you can discharge your student debt in bankruptcy, but you have to kind of pay it for those 7 years. Again, this was a concession that the Canadian government made to the 5 big banks, Royal Bank, TD, Scotia, CIBC, and the Bank of Montreal, who adjudicate most student debt in Canada, basically to give them some security that they would get most of their money back, right? So, in Canada, you can discharge it after 7 years. It's a little bit unclear legally whether that means 7 years after you finished whatever degree you took the loan out on, or say if you took the loan out on your undergrad and then 3 years later you went back and started a master's degree, whether it's at the end of the 7 years following the end of your master's degree. There's been legal arguments that it should reset at that point, so you should stay in debt for longer, but it's never been tested out at the Supreme Court level, so we don't have an exact ruling on how that should work. But generally it's been held as after you finish whatever degree, 7 years after that, you can discharge that debt in bankruptcy, which is still a long time, right? So, and again, if you don't stop paying your student loans, because they will come after you. Very aggressive debt collectors, they hand it over to debt collection agencies, and it is a generally pretty nasty process. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is just a chart from Twenge's Generations, just showing the change in the cost of post-secondary education, between 1964, that's the total cost, right, and 2018, where essentially, right, it had risen, from about a little less than $8,000, like $7,800 total in 1964, up to, over $20,000 and I don't remember how the cost, grants, and loans for undergraduates, 2019 dollars, 1964 to 2019, right? So this is inflation adjusted, right? So in today's dollars, the education in 1964 would have cost you less than $8,000, and today, it's more than $20,000. So that is her contribution. And how am I doing for time? Bad? Super bad? No, 5 minutes. I see people packing up, and I'm like, I must be out of time. No, I've got lots of time left. Yeah, academic attainment and eventual employment is also highly tied to family background. This is sometimes referred to as the intergenerational transfer of advantage, right? So for every additional year of school your parents have, there's a 5% greater chance of your children attending university. This seems to, in large part, be tied to the fact that parents with more education will tend to pass education on as a value to their children, right? It's like, if you did really well becoming an engineer because you went to a 4-year university degree, and you've had a fabulous, wonderful life, you own a boat and a vacation home and whatever, you're likely to tell your children that that is the path to success. The more time you spent in university, right, the more likely you are to tie whatever success you had to that education. Okay. And I mean, generally speaking, children from higher backgrounds tend to have, better literacy, like higher socioeconomic backgrounds, have higher literacy rates. They attend school for longer. They get better grades, and they get better jobs at the end of the day. This does, in some senses, seem to be tied to more engaged parents, right? Upper income parents have more time, right? Because they're not working 2 jobs, just trying to keep ahead of things. They have more social capital that they can pass on to their kids, right? They're more networked with people that can help their children. And they, tend to teach more interaction with the adult world in ways that create cultural capital for their kids. They also tend to foster, qualities that are of interest to their children, right? So they will tend to find the things that their children are really good at or interested in, and basically pay large sums of money to foster those qualities, right? My daughter is currently taking horseback riding lessons. They are not cheap, but she really loves it. So I'm just going to take out another mortgage. So it's pricey. We are fostering the things that she's interested in, and I don't know. Like now, I think I've said she says she's either going to be a pastry chef or she's going to own a ranch. That's her life plan at the moment. We'll see how that turns out. She also doesn't like stinky things, so I don't know how that's going to go with the ranching. Okay. Do I still have a moment? I have 2 moments. All right, let's stop there. We'll talk about credentialism in a sec at the beginning of next class. I'm almost done, but we'll let you go here, and we'll finish this up next class, and we'll start in on work. We'll start in on work on Wednesday. I'm working on your exams. I got part of them marked on the weekend, but I didn't quite finish. What's that? No, pretty good. Yeah, they look about normal to me. I don't see any really big concerns. I hope to have them done by the end of the week before you go for reading week, but we'll see. My 4-year-old also currently has a cold, so this tends to derail my life a little bit. But we'll see you on Wednesday. Have a good day. You as well. And stop streaming.